This is probably the biggest key for growing onions that will store really well. Hello my wonderful friends. Today I'm going to show you how I'm taking my onions from this to this to this to this. It's going to be quite a warm day today, and I thought I'd better get out into the tunnel house. Up here we've got all our onions drying, and I'm getting a little bit concerned that they're actually going to start cooking out in the heat. I had thrown a whole lot of fleece, what's it called? Frost cloth over the top of them to help block some of the sun, but it really is just getting to the point where I think they need to come inside. I'm going to be honest with you, it's actually far too bright for you to be sitting on the tripod for me to be able to talk to you. So I've set you on a bed of onions. I hope you don't mind. You won't smell too badly. What I'm doing is I have decided that I don't want to buy onion seeds ever again, and because of that I bought a bunch of different types of onions from some people that are known for saving really good seed, as opposed to buying commercial seed, and I am going to try my very best to pick the best ones of those to grow seeds from again next year. I did this last year as well, so I have got a couple of onions that survived the entire winter being stored, and I've put them back in the ground so that they can go to flower this summer, which seems to be working. When you very first harvest your onions, you're going to harvest them while the tops are just starting to flop over, and the tops of them are usually still quite green, and the idea is you leave them out in the sun for a couple of days for the outside skin to sort of start hardening off, and then you move them to somewhere that's preferably not in direct sunlight but still warm and has plenty of airflow for these tops to start drying off. Out of every planting of onions, you'll probably get a few that are over ambitious and try to go to flower in their first season. These onions will not store well, they won't last well, and actually you don't want to keep the seed from them either, because that's passing on the inheritable traits of going to seed far too early. What I have found using commercial seed is I don't know what they're doing when they're getting seed to save to sell to the public, but I suspect they're saving the seeds from the onions that are flowering in their first season. The reason I suspect this is because if your business is all about selling seeds and it's all about profit, it makes more sense to save seeds off things that are going to seed in their first year rather than having to store them all for a whole season to let them flower again and go to seed again the next year. I have no proof that this is the case, but I am finding that commercially available seeds, I'm having a huge number of them go to flowers in the first season, which of course means they don't store well. And I often find they're actually smaller onions as well. Compare this one to like this one. This one's gone to seed. This one will store beautifully. These onions have been out here for about 2 weeks now, and most of them are starting to dry off quite nicely. Some of them still have quite a few green bits on them, but because I'm worried about them cooking in the sun, I'm going to move them inside and plait them together anyway. But any of the ones that have grown flower stalks like this, I'm simply cutting the stalk off, so it's leaving a good inch or so, maybe, yeah, 1.5 inches. I'm also cutting off the roots off the bottom, because a lot of those are still quite dusty. When I'm cutting the roots off, I am still leaving the little nubby roots there. I'm not cutting right down into the core. The idea is to not damage the actual fruit, the bulb itself, but it is to cut the wiry bits off so that they don't look so messy. And these ones I'm going to put in a bucket in the kitchen to use very first, because with that big stalk up the middle, they're still quite usable, but they're definitely not going to store. If I had a whole lot of these, which I have done in the past, what I do is I peel them, throw them through the food processor to slice them, and then either put them in the dehydrator to make onion powder, or I put them in bags in the freezer to use as free flow pre-cut onions. Because when you've got an entire harvest of about 200 onions that have all gone to seed, it's quite disheartening, and you can't use all of those within a month or two. So it's a really good way of storing them if they have gone to seed on you. Now these bigger ones, again, I'm cutting the roots off, just using a sharp pair of secateurs, which honestly aren't as sharp as I'd like them to be. And then I'm leaving all of the haggledy-paggledy. If it's particularly dirty, I'll pick it off. But leaving all the dry skin, because that's what will protect the inside. And I'm leaving these tails on as well. Two options with those. One is you can just get a whole lot of them and like rubber band tie them together, or put some string on them, tie them together, and hang them in bunches. What I'm going to try and do is plait them together where you kind of weave them. I'll show you shortly how you weave them together, so you can hang up a big long, I don't even know what you call it, a hanging of onions. So that's what I'm planning on doing. So once I've cut those off, I'm just sticking them in the wheelbarrow behind me, and I'm going to wheelbarrow them all down to the barn. So this will take me a wee while because there's so many of them, but it is a very basic, simple process, and it's the larger, longer storing ones that I'm hoping to save some seeds from. This is probably the biggest key for growing onions that will store really well and grow really well in your area, and that is to grow them from seed. Saving seeds from onions is really easy, but you do need the space to allow you to put the onions back in and to go to flower, and they do grow quite a massive flower stalk. I've got some in the tunnel house that are in their second season and they've gone off to flower, and I've left them in because the bees really like the flowers, and it helps attract beneficials like hoverflies and ladybugs, all sorts of beneficial things, which have helped me combat my aphids, which has been really helpful. To save them for seed, what you want to do is find a good firm, this one here I suspect will store quite well. It's not huge, but it's a good medium-sized onion, and it's nice and firm, and its top has dried off beautifully. This is the sort of thing I'll be keeping my eye on over winter. You can tell when they start sprouting because they literally will send up another green shoot up through the middle, and usually that would mean that I would use them straight away. And my plan is to hopefully save the last few onions that are ever going to sprout out of this batch and save those, and then come springtime, once the frosts have passed, I can stick them out into the garden and let them regrow. Once they grow a flower, eventually some of those flowers will turn into seed, and you just leave them to dry on the plant as long as you can, really, but you don't want them dropping the seed everywhere. So once you can see the wee black bits inside the flowers, that's when you can chop the flower stalk off and transfer it into a paper bag to try and catch all the seeds. To keep genetic diversity up, you want to be doing this with more than just one onion. Ideally, I think I'll be doing it with sort of probably about 6 onions, but that's going to give me a lot of onion seed. The upside is I've got a lot of friends that garden, so I'll be able to share that onion seed around. What I don't want to do is keep all onion seed just from one onion, because that reduces your genetic diversity quite significantly. And the idea is to do at least 6 onions. More would be even better. And onion seed will hold its viability for a few years, so I don't necessarily have to do this every single year, but I think for the aim of improving the crop, I probably will do it every year for a few years, to try and get some seed that are well adapted to my local garden, our local environment, because the good seed that I ended up getting is from a guy in Christchurch, who again, he's been working really hard on getting onions that store well again. And his onions are these ones that have, the tops have dried off and they haven't sprouted. These ones that have sprouted were from a commercial seed packet that I had. So I thought, oh well, I'll just grow all of them. They're technically all the same variety, but the difference between the ones that have been saved for a few generations to store well and the ones that are straight from the commercial crop, the difference was actually quite significant. I don't know if you can buy onion sets in New Zealand. It's not something I have ever attempted to buy. I have noticed in the US a lot of people buy onion sets, and that's what you grow your onions from. And what they are basically is tiny little onion bulbs, kind of like this, maybe even slightly smaller. The problem with that is they've already been through one season, so when you plant this, it will get bigger, but it's also going to think it's in its second season. So the odds are you're going to grow a lot more flower heads from using onion sets than you will if you're using onion seed. Onions are incredibly easy to grow from seed, as long as you get the right type for where you are. We grow what's called long day onions, which I think is all that's really available in New Zealand, because where New Zealand is, we all qualify for growing long day onions. So they're ones that are triggered to bulb once the day length gets over 12 hours. So they won't start setting their bulb until after the summer solstice. So the idea with those is if you're growing long day onions, you sow them around the winter solstice, so that the days are getting longer and longer and longer, and then they will start triggering to bulb around Christmas time, which is when our summer solstice is, and then they're ready to harvest in late summer once the tops start flopping over. If you live somewhere super hot like Texas, for example, you will want to grow your onions over the winter, in which case you need onions that do the complete opposite. You need ones that you can sow in sort of late summer, early autumn, or early fall, and then they are triggered to bulb as the days start getting shorter, hence the name short day onions. Either way, neither of them should be going to seed in their first season. Either way, they should be able to store for a good few months before they start reshooting and resprouting. The more sulfur your plants have in them, the longer they're going to store. So the sweeter the onion, the less they are going to store. So red onions are notorious for not storing very well. So again, I've got these onions from the same guy that's been carefully working on genetics to get them to store better. And so I have high hopes for at least getting a couple of months storage out of some of these red onions. If you want onions that are going to store extra super well, which for a lot of us that are trying to grow all our own food, that's quite important. One thing you can do is add some extra sulfur to your garden beds, and that will boost the sulfur content of your onions and garlic, which will make them last longer. The other thing you can do is make sure you're growing long storage onions, so they're not the sweet onions. Sweet onions are brilliant, they're delicious, but just don't expect them to store very long. Just be aware that if you're growing anything that says sweet in its title, in its name, it's not going to store as well as a bog standard long lasting brown onion will. I have seen people saying these tricks and tips for growing really big onions, and they tend to do what's called spooning, which is when they go around, when the onion starts bulbing, they go around with a spoon and scoop all the dirt off from around the outside edge. Honestly, I've tried that and not found any difference. This was grown just by letting nature take its course. I don't think spooning is really all that beneficial. I've done spooning before and got a whole crop that was like maximum this big. So I think honestly making sure they got plenty of water while they're starting to bulb up is probably going to give you a lot bigger onions than fluffing around, pulling the dirt out from around all of them. These things are designed to push the dirt around them. I guess maybe if your dirt's super compacted, then maybe that might be a helpful thing to do. But I suspect actually it probably doesn't do all that much, but it makes you feel like you're doing something that's going to give you better onions. I think what you're better off doing is growing your onions in soil that isn't compacted. Like every other plant, onions prefer well draining, nice, loose, fluffy, full of organic matter soil to grow in. If you're trying to grow them in clay, no amount of spooning is going to give you big onions. And I think if you're growing in beautiful, soft, fluffy compost, no amount of anything is going to give you sad, crappy onions. If your onions have any sign of any kind of fungal infection, preferably even if they've got any sign of rust, you wouldn't keep them as seed onions, because those sorts of fungal issues and some bacterial issues can end up in the actual tissue of the onions, which means they'll pass it on to their babies, which is not what you want to do if you're saving your own seed stock. To have the healthiest onions possible, making sure you're adding plenty of compost to the soil, and then making sure your soil has a relatively high sulfur content, and making sure that the plants have everything they need to grow quick and robust, which means they need plenty of nitrogen in that first phase, because the more leaves that they grow in that first phase, the bigger your onions are going to be, because every single one of these leaves turns into a layer of onion. So plenty of nitrogen in that first little while, and then ease off it once you hit your bulbing date, which for us is the summer solstice. After that, you don't need to give them any more nitrogen. They're not going to be growing any more leaves. They're going to swap over to bulbing. So that's when you need to make sure they're getting plenty of moisture and that you're keeping the weeds away so they have space and ability and moisture and resources to bulb nicely. There are so many ways of tying up these onions. One option is to literally just plait them or braid them the same way you would do with your hair. Split them into 3 and add some in each time. I find that ends up with a really thick braid at the end and I don't really love it. What I've started doing is a variation on stringing onions, and either do it a double way or a single way. The single way is easier. I tie a string to the bottom onion, pull it up with the tassels, the fluffy top bits, and then use that to each onion. You sort of wrap it around. You use the tops, you wrap them around the string and the tops of the other ones, and then you flip the onion over the tops you've just tied and then pull that top up to join in with the rest of them. And that's quite a good way of securing them without having to fluff around actually plaiting them or having to tie them individually. And for the most part it holds as long as your tops have still got some flexibility and have plenty of length in them. These onions will store slightly longer than the ones stuck in a box because the airflow can get right around them. However, there's a limit to my willingness to stand here and tie all of these onions, so eventually I get to the point where I just snip the tops off and throw them in a box. Obviously I've separated out all the ones that we're going to seed, that have got the thick stalks on the top that aren't going to keep, ready to use first. Then you just need to store everything in sort of a cool, dark place as best you can, somewhere with some airflow. But none of this is helpful if you can't get your onions off to the best start possible. I have a video all about starting seedlings here that you can check out, and I will see you in the next one.